Welcome to the video for Latitude and Longitude. I am Mrs. Lehnert, and this is Earth Science at HSHM. For today's video, you need your input page for latitude and longitude, and you're going to need a pen or a pencil. Our learning objective today is that students will be able to plot locations given latitude and longitude coordinates and state the latitude and longitude coordinates given a location. So hopefully you already know what latitude and longitude are, but if you don't, we're going to walk through it together. Latitude lines are lines that measure distance in degrees north and south of the equator. So your equator is labeled right here. You have a diagram just like this on your input page. So after you copy down the definition, you should trace that line with your pen or pencil and then label it EQ for equator. Longitude lines are lines that measure distance in degrees east and west of the prime meridian. So just like for the latitude, make sure you copy that definition on your input page. And then I would trace this line right here. This one is a longitude line, and this is we would call it a reference line, just like the equator was a reference line for latitude. This is the prime meridian. So I'm going to label it PM for prime meridian, and you should do that on your input page as well. Remember, if I'm going too fast, you can always pause this video, rewind it, and play the parts that you missed. So one of the things that confuses students a lot of times is, why do we measure latitude and longitude lines in degrees? A lot of people think, well, isn't that for temperature, degrees and temperature? And no, that can be just any kind of angle measurement. Angles are measured in degrees. So I want you to imagine that you are this stick figure right here. That's kind of important. I'm going to ask you to imagine a lot in just a second. So we're going to shrink you down and put you in the center of the earth. There you are. Like, we're going to drill down through the street. We're going to go past all the dirt. We're going to actually drill and put you into the center of the earth, okay? Scientists can't do that yet, but you're using your imagination for this. So there you are in the center of the earth. Now, if you put your arm straight out in front of you so that it's level with the ground and you point like that, you're going to be pointing at the equator from within the earth. And if you were to spin around, your finger would actually trace the equator line all the way around the earth. So now, imagine that you put your arm straight above you and point. What are you pointing at? If you guessed the North Pole, then you are right. What angle does that make compared with when your arm was at the equator? And if you guessed a 90-degree angle, you're right. So that's why the North Pole's latitude is 90 degrees north, because it makes this 90-degree angle. It's 90 degrees above or up north from the equator. And then the same thing for the South Pole. If I were to point at the South Pole, this makes a 90-degree angle, but this time we're going south of the equator. And if we were going to point here at about 45 degrees, which is close to New York City, we're at 41 degrees north, then this angle that we're making here from the equator up to 45 degrees is 45 degrees, and so that's the 45-degree north latitude. And guess what? This same idea applies to longitude lines. So let's look at those next. Again, put yourself in the center of the earth, right here. This time, imagine that you point straight toward you, level with the ground. Boom, just like that. That's what we call 0 degrees longitude. We actually call it the prime meridian. And then if you were to spin in a circle and point exactly in the opposite direction, this would be you pointing in the opposite direction here. You just spun around 180 degrees, which is half of a circle, and that's 180 degrees longitude. If you only spun around a quarter of the way, well, that would be 90 degrees, which would be right here. And just like with latitude, you can point in different directions, but instead of going north or south of the equator, longitude is measuring to the right, this way, or east of the prime meridian, or you can go to the left of the prime meridian, which would be west of the prime meridian. So when we're measuring these degrees, you have to kind of picture that when we came up with this stuff, people were thinking about being in the center of the earth. So why do we need to understand all of this stuff anyway, latitude and longitude? Don't I just use my GPS or my Google Maps to figure out how to get around? Well, yeah, you do, but latitude and longitude is actually the basis of GPS, of Google Maps. Google Maps on your phone wouldn't work if people didn't understand latitude and longitude coordinates in the first place. And we kind of all take this for granted, but Google employees had to tell the computers how to find you so that the computer would know where to put that little blue dot. So yes, the satellites track you automatically and they move that little dot around, that little blue dot U moves around, but somebody had to tell the computers, the satellites, your phone, how to do that. And they did that with latitude and longitude coordinates. So let's practice. We have 4 different locations identified by letter on your map on your input page. Let's circle them. We have G. Point G is down here in the lower right-hand side. Point B is kind of in the middle. Point C is lower right-hand side again. And finally, point I is kind of toward the left of your map, right there. Let's start with location G. My first step is always to find out what its latitude is. Okay, latitude we use first, and then we always put longitude second. So the first question that I always think about is, which one is which? Where is the latitude line? So I always remember latitude as lat is flat. So if I'm looking at point G, it is on this latitude line right here. Okay, so latitude lines are flat lines. They're always like parallel or level with the ground. That's the way I think of that, right? So the next thing you need to think about is, what is the number for the latitude line that you're on? In this case, the numbers for the latitude lines are always at the end of the lines. Same thing with longitude lines. The numbers are at the ends or the edges of the lines. This line goes all the way over to the right and all the way over to the left. And you'll notice that the number is the same on the left-hand side as it is on the right-hand side over here. It's 30 degrees. So that's going to be my number for latitude. So for G, it's going to be 30 degrees for my number. Now, latitude always includes a direction, north, south, east, or west. The only time that doesn't happen is if you are exactly on the equator or exactly on the prime meridian. Then it's just 0 degrees and there's no north, south, east, or west with it. But since we're at 30 degrees, I'm going to either be north or south of the equator for a latitude line. Because remember, this latitude line runs parallel to the equator. Whereas the equator is right here. So I am going to actually label on my map, and you should too, the equator, so that way we remember that horizontal line is the latitude line, the equator. And in order to figure out the direction, north, south, east, or west, you have to think to yourself, where is this 30-degree line compared to the equator? Is it north of it? Is it south of it, it meaning the equator? So is it north of the equator, south of the equator, east of the equator, or west of the equator? This whole line is actually below the equator. And if you know your directions, north, south, east, and west, you know that if something's going down on a map, then we're south of the equator. So I'm going to put a south, or an S, after my 30 degrees. So I've got my latitude. Now I have to put the longitude after that. So you always put latitude first, and then you're going to put a little comma after that. And now we're going to put the longitude after that. So again, looking at point G, find your longitude line. Longitude lines always go up and down. Okay? I think of them as longitude. So if you actually say the word longitude, your mouth kind of opens up and it kind of spreads out vertically, up and down wise. So that's how I remember longitude lines. And a longitude line is going to be measured east or west of the prime meridian. Where's the prime meridian on this map? Remember, it's the reference point, so it is going to be at 0. So here's a 0, and at the bottom there's a 0. So I know that this is my prime meridian. I'm going to label that on my map. You should too. That is PM for prime meridian. So if we look at the numbers at the top and at the bottom of this red line that I've drawn on the map, we can see that point G, is at 150 degrees. So I'm going to write that on my paper. So 150 degrees. And now we have to put the direction. So again, think about where this red line is compared to the prime meridian blue line. If I start at the prime meridian and I go to my 150 degrees line, what direction am I going? And if you said east, you are correct, because we're going toward the right, which is east. So I'm going to say east, or I'm going to put an E after the 150 degrees. All right, let's try another one. Let's go with point C, which is really close to point G. What do I do first? What am I trying to find first? Latitude or longitude? If you said latitude, you were correct. Here's my latitude line that C is on, the green line that I just drew. And hopefully you see right away that it's exactly on the equator. So for point C, I just write 0 degrees. I don't have to put any direction because it is the equator. It's not north or south of the equator. Sorry that my lines or my numbers aren't showing up exactly on the lines. So next I have to figure out my longitude. Remember, longitude lines are vertical, straight up and down, long, right? And I can see that the number that point C is on is 120. So I'm going to write 120. You should write it on the line. And now I have to figure out what the direction for that number is. Remember, again, you are measuring longitude lines compared to the prime meridian. So what direction is it from the prime meridian? Remember, here's your prime meridian in blue. So if I'm going from the prime meridian to point C, to the longitude for point C, I'm going east again. So it's going to be 120 degrees east. So point C, the latitude and longitude coordinates are 0 degrees, 120 degrees east. All right, let's try point B. Point B is in the middle of the map. I'm going to use black this time. And it's on that latitude line, because remember I start with latitude first. The latitude of point B on either side, that number is the same. It is 60 degrees. So I know that for point B, it's going to be 60 degrees. And now I have to figure out the direction. Since this is a latitude line, lat is flat. I know that I'm going to be measuring this compared to the equator, which is that blue line that I just drew. So, what direction do I put after 60 degrees? You should have said, oh, I have to go from the equator to that 60-degree line. I am going in the direction of north. So north, I put an N after 60 degrees. Then you put a comma, and we figure out what the longitude would be. Point B is on this longitude line, and if you look at the numbers at the top of that line, on either end of that line, it is 0 degrees. So I'm going to say 0 degrees. And since it's right on a reference line, the 0 degree line, which is the prime meridian, I do not have to put a direction after that. All right, here's your last example for point I. Point I, remember, is on the left-hand side of the map over there. Think about what your first step is. Go through the whole thing and see if you can figure out on your own what the latitude and longitude coordinates would be for point I. I'm going to leave it up here. Question is going to pop up. You choose the latitude and longitude coordinates that you think should be for point I. Once you're finished, click Continue to see if you're correct. So this one was a little tricky because now point I was in between a couple of the labeled latitude lines. So the way I figured this out was halfway between 30 and 60 would be 45, and so that's how I knew that I was on a latitude of 45 degrees. And since it is north of the equator, I put an N behind that. And then the longitude was a little bit tricky too because it fell in between 90 and 120. So I had to think about what's halfway between 90 and 120, and I figured that out to be 105 degrees. And then since that was west or left of the prime meridian, I put a W behind that number. So now that you know how to actually state the latitude and longitude coordinates, we're going to go the other way. We're going to give you the latitude and longitude coordinates and see if you can figure out which letters should be at each of these locations. So we're going to start off with 0 degrees, 0 degrees. Figure out which letter you think belongs there. Enter your answer. Click Continue to see if you're correct. So hopefully you figured out that that was point A because it is exactly on the equator, which is right here, and it is exactly on the prime meridian. All right, let's try the next one. We're going to go right underneath that for 60 degrees north and 180 degrees east. Choose your answer and then click Continue to see if you're correct. So it should be point F, 60 degrees north. Remember, we are north of the equator. And 80 degrees east is this line here, which is east of the prime meridian. All right, let's try 30 degrees south and 30 degrees east. For that one, you should have figured out that it was point E. Here's 30 degrees south. I know that that is south of the equator. And 30 degrees east is this line here, which is east of the prime meridian. If you're not sure, again, make sure that you are drawing your north, south, east, west coordinates on your paper. That always helps me. And if you get confused, I always remember for east and west, I always remember wee, because north, south, east, and west, when it's placed on there correctly, it spells wee and not ew, ew, ew. That's wrong. It's always going to be wee, and hopefully that will help you out. All right, let's try the last one. 15 degrees south, 60 degrees west. And for that one, you should have gotten point L. So 15 degrees south, you can see, is halfway between points, or I'm sorry, 0 degrees and 30 degrees. And because I am down from the equator, that is south of the equator, and then L is right on this line. This is the 60-degree west line. I know it's west because it's to the left of the prime meridian, which is 0 degrees. All right, so hopefully you got those correct. If you did not, that's okay. Make it a learning experience, and now you understand. Hopefully you won't make those same mistakes later on. Okay, here's your last question to answer, and then you are done. Don't stop the video. Make sure you leave this video to continue until the very end so that way you can get credit for it, and bring your notebook and this input page to class tomorrow for your stamp. Nice job.